The bell above Starlit Haven gave a soft chime as he entered, unnoticed at first by the regulars sipping lattes and chatting over muffins. Outside, the Chicago streets were a canvas of early winter, wind-whipped, gray, indifferent. Inside, warmth clung to the mismatched furniture. The soft hum of jazz curling through the air like a memory you couldn't name but never forgot. He hesitated in the doorway, tall, elegant, with silver-threaded hair and a bespoke coat that had seen boardrooms and black-tie galas. Not cafes like this. His name was Gideon Warwick. Most knew him from headlines and magazine covers. The kind of man associated with billion-dollar deals, not black coffee and chipped mugs. But none of that power could help him now. His diagnosis, pancreatic cancer, stage 4, had left him stripped of titles and pride. 6 months to live? Maybe less. He had everything, and nothing that mattered. He slid into a quiet corner booth, like someone slipping into a memory. Hands once steady from decades of command trembled as he lifted the mug the waitress had set down without a word. He hadn't even looked at her face then. Only now did his gaze rise. Unsteady, she was pouring coffee at another table, laughing with a man in a delivery uniform. Her chestnut hair was pulled into a loose braid, her apron stained but neat, and her eyes hazel and gentle lit up when she smiled. Something in her reminded him of someone he hadn't seen in 8 years. His daughter Isadora had been 20 when they last spoke. Their final conversation had ended in slammed doors and a sentence that haunted him nightly. You don't know how to love anything that doesn't make you richer. He hadn't tried to prove her wrong, not once. His empire had consumed him. He had missed birthdays, ignored hospital calls, skimmed over tears like they were fine print in a contract. And now, with death closer than life, he would never hear her call him dad again, unless his fingers clenched around the ceramic mug. The idea wasn't logical, it wasn't sane, but grief rarely was. She returned to his table, notepad in hand. Would you like something to eat, sir? He looked up at her like a drowning man spotting shore. His voice cracked as he spoke. Would you be my daughter, just for one day? The question floated between them like ash. Her smile froze. I'm sorry, what? He shook his head, immediately ashamed. I know how it sounds. I'm dying. I have no one. I haven't spoken to my real daughter in years, and I'm trying to make peace before I go. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she sat across from him without asking, folding her hands in her lap like she was steadying something inside herself. People usually come here for the scones, not surrogate families, she said, her voice quiet. I didn't know where else to go, Gideon admitted, but when I saw you, something about you reminded me of her, not her face, her spirit. Her name was Juniper Vale 25, a waitress by necessity, not by dream. Her mother Maris had been in and out of the hospital for a decade with kidney failure. Juniper worked 3 jobs just to keep the electricity on, and the medical bills barely behind. Her life was resilience wrapped in caffeine, but there was softness in her eyes, something untouched by bitterness. She could have walked away. Anyone else would have, but she stayed. What does being your daughter mean, exactly? She asked finally. Careful. Gideon's eyes glistened. Just one day, a meal, a conversation, maybe a walk in the park. I've built a legacy, but I've forgotten how to love. I'm not asking you to pretend for I'm asking you to help me remember what it feels like to be forgiven. Silence stretched thin between them. She looked down at her chipped nail. Polish? Then back up. I'm not an actress, she said. I'm not asking for a performance, he replied. Just one honest day, that's all. A part of her wanted to say no, to tell him she wasn't anyone's emotional repair job, but another part, perhaps the part of her still hoping life held a few miracles, saw a man not asking for pity, but redemption. She gave a soft exhale. Okay, she said, the word small, but life-changing. One day, Gideon blinked, surprised. Truly, Juniper nodded, but you're buying breakfast. He laughed, actually laughed, a short, rough sound that seemed to unstick something in his chest. Deal. What neither of them knew was that this simple agreement would unravel decades of buried truths, that one pretend day would lead to something neither could have expected, something raw, healing, and ultimately real. Because sometimes, the family you choose finds you in the most unexpected places, and sometimes, pretending is just the beginning of something true. The morning sun broke through the cafe windows with an unfamiliar warmth, casting gold over the worn tiles and faded menu board. Gideon sat quietly in his corner booth, dressed less like a billionaire today and more like someone trying not to be noticed. Gone was the tailored coat. In its place, a simple sweater, slacks, and a nervous energy he couldn't quite mask. Juniper arrived 10 minutes late, not out of indifference, but hesitation. All night, she'd wrestled with what she'd agreed to. Pretend to be a dying billionaire's daughter. It sounded like a scene from a novel. And yet, the look in his eyes yesterday, that ache, that quiet desperation, it hadn't been fiction. She wore a soft green sweater and jeans. Her braid was neater than usual. She'd even put on a little mascara, not for him, but because something about this day felt different. Not quite a date, not quite a job, something in between. He stood when she walked in, awkwardly. I wasn't sure you'd come. I almost didn't, she admitted, sliding into the booth across from him, but then I thought, If someone asked me to help them feel loved, even just for a day, maybe that's not the kind of request you ignore. His throat tightened. Again, it wasn't pity in her voice. It was something softer, human. The waitress approached, confused to see Juniper on the customer side of the counter. Your usual? Juniper smiled. And whatever he's having? Gideon chuckled. Black coffee and guilt. The waitress blinked, uncertain, and wandered off. So, Juniper said after a moment, if I'm your daughter today, what exactly do you want us to do? Gideon reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled list, handwritten, folded and refolded a dozen times. He passed it to her with care, like it was more fragile than it looked. She opened it. The handwriting was surprisingly neat. The title read, Things I Should Have Done with My Daughter. Juniper's eyes slowed on each line. Laugh over pancakes, visit a used bookstore, feed ducks at Lincoln Park, tell her I'm proud, apologize. Listen, she looked up at him. You want to do all of this today? If you'll let me. She hesitated, fingers still on the list. That last one. Listen. He nodded. I always talked, directed, decided. I never listened. Maybe today you tell me who you are. And I finally shut up. Juniper folded the list, tucked it into her purse. Then, let's start with pancakes. At a small diner 2 blocks down, they ordered a stack so tall, the waitress laughed, bringing it over. Gideon watched Juniper cut her food, pour syrup, laugh with her whole face. It stunned him how quickly this pretend morning began to feel real. Your daughter? Juniper asked, curious now. Isadora, right? Did she look like me? She was blonder, shorter, but the way you talk to people, the kindness, she used to have that, before I ruined it. Juniper paused, then reached for her coffee. Why did she stop talking to you? He didn't answer right away. She wanted to open a music school. For kids? I thought it was a waste. Told her if she wanted money, she'd need to study law or finance. She screamed that all I cared about was control. She left with a violin case and 1 suitcase. Never looked back. Juniper stared at her plate. That's hard. He nodded, harder now. When I don't even know if she'd care if I died. Silence lingered. She might. Juniper said gently. Sometimes daughters are waiting for their fathers to do something brave, like admit they were wrong. Gideon looked away, his jaw working. I'm trying, I know. They walked to the park after breakfast. The snow hadn't fallen yet, but the air was sharp. Gideon held the bag of breadcrumbs while Juniper tossed pieces toward the ducks waddling near the pond. Did you always want to work at a cafe? He asked. She laughed. Never. I want to open a bakery. Like a real one. Big windows, cinnamon in the air, handwritten notes in the cookie boxers. He smiled. Sounds magical. It was my mom's dream. I borrowed it. She was a baker before. She got sick. Now I just work to keep her dialysis going. That's a lot to carry. Juniper nodded. But I've got strong legs. Gideon watched her for a moment. If I'd been your real father, I would have been proud of that. She didn't reply right away, but her lip trembled just slightly. Thanks. I needed to hear that. Even if it's pretend. He looked at her. It doesn't feel pretend. And that scared them both. That evening, they sat on a bench overlooking the skyline. The city blinked like a distant galaxy, glittering and indifferent. You're not just doing this for yourself. Are you? Juniper asked softly. Gideon turned to her surprised. What do you mean? You're trying to say goodbye to someone, not just a daughter who's gone, but the man you were. He exhaled. You're sharper than I thought, and you're not as broken as you think. They sat in silence for a while longer, 2 souls caught in the quiet moment where something fragile begins to mend. The city pulsed on, but in that small corner of the world, a billionaire and a waitress pretending, healing, learning found something neither had planned, and neither of them knew that before the week was over, everything would change again. The next morning, Juniper woke to an envelope taped to her apartment door. It was cream-colored, thick, and elegant, nothing like the junk mail and past-due notices that usually cluttered her small world. Her name was handwritten across the front, in looping script, unfamiliar yet careful. Inside a note, yesterday, I remembered how it feels to laugh. Thank you. Today, if you're willing, I'd like to show you a place I built for the wrong reasons, and maybe find a right reason to return there. A driver will be waiting at 9. Gideon. Juniper stared at the letter, heart thudding. She hadn't expected a second day. She hadn't planned on saying yes again, but somehow, the idea of not showing up felt wrong, like breaking a promise to someone who still had too many apologies left to speak. She arrived outside to find a sleek black car idling at the curb. The driver nodded, opened the door, and she slipped into leather seats that smelled faintly of expensive cologne and old regrets. When she stepped out again, her breath caught in her throat. The building was a glass and steel tower, 30 stories high, etched with the name Warwick Global Holdings. It shimmered like ambition itself, intimidating and cold. People in tailored suits rushed in and out, eyes glued to phones, voices sharp. But at the center of the lobby stood Gideon, no longer in disguise, a navy suit, polished shoes, silver cufflinks, the billionaire persona fully restored. He looked at her differently now, not as a stranger, not even as a waitress, but as someone who saw past it all. You brought me to your empire. Juniper asked, arms crossed. I brought you to my prison. Gideon replied quietly. He led her through silent elevators, up past executive floors and golden plaques. Finally, they entered a private office unlike anything she'd imagined, floor-to-ceiling windows, walls lined with books, and a massive desk that seemed carved from authority itself. This is where I became the man my daughter walked away from. He said, deals over dinners, power over people, profits over love. Juniper walked to the window. Then why bring me here? He hesitated, then opened a drawer and pulled out a small, dust-covered photo frame. Inside was a picture of Isadora at 15, holding a violin, laughing at something just out of frame. He held it like it weighed more than any stock portfolio. Thought if I showed you where I failed, he said, maybe I'd finally stop pretending I still had time to fix it. Juniper looked around. Everything screamed success. And yet, in the silence, it all felt hollow. Maybe your daughter didn't leave because of who you were in here, she said gently. Maybe she left because she didn't know who you were outside of here. That hit him deeper than he expected. Do you still love her? She asked. Every day. Then tell her. I've tried. Letters, gifts, no reply. Have you ever said you were sorry, without expecting her to forgive you? Gideon blinked. No. Juniper stepped closer. Start there. They spent the rest of the morning exploring the office. Juniper, asking about old deals, about the art on the walls, about the rare globe in the corner that still spun smooth despite its age. She was curious, honest, not impressed by wealth, but fascinated by what it tried to hide. Then she paused near a shelf of sealed boxes. What's in those unopened letters? He admitted. Mostly regrets I never sent. She turned to him. Then maybe it's time you opened one. He didn't answer. Instead, he picked up a sealed envelope, one addressed in handwriting less refined, messier. The date was from 8 years ago. He opened it with trembling hands and began to read aloud. Isadora, I said things I didn't mean. I pushed you away when you needed me near. If I could go back, I'd sit through every off-key violin lesson just to hear your joy. If you ever read this, please know, you were never a failure. I was just too blind to see your light. Love, Dad. Juniper wiped a tear from her cheek. You wrote that 8 years ago. I did. Then let's not wait another 8 to send the next one. Later that afternoon, Gideon asked Juniper if she'd join him for a dinner, his first home-cooked meal in over a decade. They drove to a quiet part of town, where a brownstone stood tucked between two towering apartment buildings. Inside, the space was warm, untouched by opulence. Old photos lined the mantel. Dusty records leaned beside a player. It was a home, not a mansion, and for once Gideon looked like he belonged there. They cooked together. Well, Juniper cooked. Gideon mostly sliced vegetables like he was diffusing a bomb. As the soup simmered, he told her about Isidora's first school recital, how she'd forgotten the notes but kept playing, eyes closed, smiling, how the entire crowd had stood and clapped not for her skill, but for her courage. I never told her I was proud, he said. You still can, Juniper whispered. He looked up. What if she doesn't want to hear it? Juniper offered a small smile. Then you say it anyway, because it's not just for her, it's for you, too. They ate at a small table near the window. The food was simple. The conversation wasn't. They talked about death, about memory, about the aching space between regret and forgiveness. And then, Gideon said something that stopped Juniper cold. I need your help with something important tomorrow, he said quietly. It's bigger than just this one day. Juniper tilted her head. What kind of help? But he didn't answer directly. Instead, he reached across the table, took her hand gently, and said, I want to change someone's life before mine ends, maybe even 2 lives. And I think you're the only person who can help me do it. Juniper didn't know it yet, but this moment, the stillness, the warmth, the uncertainty, was the beginning of something far more complicated than pretend. And in less than 24 hours, she would face a decision that could rewrite everything she thought she knew about trust, legacy, and love. Juniper stood frozen on the steps of the courthouse. The morning had started like any other, except for the white envelope in her coat pocket. Gideon had given it to her before the driver picked her up. If you trust me, he'd said with that quiet gravity that always made her breath catch, open it when you get there. She had. Now she couldn't move. Inside had been a notarized document, a legal declaration with her name on it, and Gideon's signature. It wasn't money. It wasn't property. It was custody, temporary, symbolic, and entirely voluntary. But it was real. Today, the document read, I, Gideon Warwick, recognize Juniper Vale as the daughter I never had the courage to know. This is not a legal transfer of parenthood. This is a public acknowledgement of love, of regret, of healing, for one day, for always. A judge had agreed to sign off. As part of Gideon's and Dove life legal arrangements, he wanted one day record where he did something that wasn't about control or wealth or power. Juniper's hands trembled. Her chest felt too small for her ribs. She'd come here thinking they were going to meet a lawyer about a foundation or donation. Not this. Not something so intimate, so irreversible in its emotional weight. The grand wooden doors behind her creaked open. Gideon stepped out, walking slower than usual. His face was pale. the lines under his eyes deeper today. She hadn't realized how much weaker he'd looked until now. He smiled when he saw her. You read it? She nodded, unsure whether to laugh, cry, or run. What is this? Gideon. This, he said gently, is me trying to leave something behind that isn't measured in profits. By making me your symbolic daughter. By giving my soul one day of peace. And giving you something I never gave Isadora a choice. She swallowed hard. This isn't pretend anymore. No, it never really was. They went inside. The hearing brief, formal, and strange. The clerk looked confused. The judge was intrigued. The papers were filed. And just like that, a billionaire who had built empires had rewritten the most broken chapter of his life with a waitress who once served him coffee. Afterward, they didn't speak for a while. Instead, they walked through a winter market downtown, where lights were strung between booths and the air smelled like cinnamon and roasted nuts. A brass band played old carols. Children danced in heavy boots. It felt normal, beautifully, painfully normal. Then Gideon stopped walking. Juniper turned. His hand was on his chest. Gideon. He leaned against a lamppost, breath shallow. No hospitals. He gasped, just let me sit. She helped him to a bench, panic flooding her veins. You should have told me you weren't well today, she said, voice breaking. I didn't want this to be about dying. I wanted it to be about living. But you're not okay. He reached into his coat, pulled out a small black box, and handed it to her. Inside was a key. What is this? She asked, heart pounding. It's to the bakery on Fulton Street. I bought the lease, paid a year in advance. There's equipment, inventory, everything. Her mouth opened, but no words came. It's yours, he whispered. I had my lawyers draft a clean contract. No strings. Just one condition. Tears welled in her eyes. Why? Because yesterday you told me about your dream. And today, I want to prove that someone listened. That someone believed in you. That a man who spent a lifetime breaking things can maybe help build something. She looked at him. At the man whose time was slipping through his fingers like sand and yet all he wanted was to lift someone else up before it was gone. I don't know what to say, she whispered. Then just promise me you'll make the world smell like cinnamon. She laughed, choking on tears. I can do that. A silence settled, not heavy, peaceful. Then Gideon said, almost in a whisper, will you help me write a letter to Isadora? Juniper squeezed his hand. Only, if you let me start it? He nodded. She pulled out a napkin and a pen from her purse. And as the world buzzed around them, two strangers no longer strangers began. A letter that had waited 8 years to be written, and neither of them knew that someone had already been watching. From just across the square, a woman in a red coat, a violin case in her hand, and eyes that shimmered with disbelief. Because sometimes, when you finally open your heart, the person you've been waiting for is closer than you think. Asterisks. She didn't mean to follow them. Isadora Warwick had been in Chicago for a conference, nothing special, just another investor summit. She hadn't planned to wander into the winter market. She hadn't meant to stop when she saw a familiar silhouette leaning on a bench, looking impossibly older, impossibly fragile. But when she saw her father, and the young woman sitting beside him, holding his hand like she belonged, there's something in her chest cracked open. 8 years, 8 birthdays, 8 angry, aching Christmases. And now this dot. At first, she thought she was wrong, that the woman might be a nurse or an assistant. But when Gideon smiled at her with an expression she'd never seen on his face before, soft, unguarded, Riel had hit her like a storm. She was too far away to hear the words, but she saw him pass something to the girl, a small box. And when the girl opened it, Isadora saw her cry, not politely, not performatively, but like someone who had just been handed the world. And that's when Isadora realized what hurt the most. Her father had never looked at her like that. She walked away before they saw her. Back at her hotel room, she sat with her violin across her knees, unable to play. Gideon Warwick, the man who built his empire faster than he built memories, who sent tutors instead of attending recitals, who called her dramatic when she begged for 5 more minutes of his time. She had sent back every birthday gift. She had ignored every email. She had blocked every number. And still, something about seeing him like that, grayer, smaller, almost gentle, made her feel like a child again. She didn't know who the waitress was, but something in her face, the way she looked at Gideon, it didn't feel like flattery. It felt like truth. So Isadora did something she hadn't done in years. She searched her father's name online, and there it was. Tucked beneath business news and legacy fund announcements, a photo of him and Juniper, blurry but unmistakable, outside a courthouse. The caption read, Billionaire CEO files symbolic custody request. Names Waitress as daughter for a day. In unusual end-of-life wish. Isadora dropped her phone. Meanwhile, back at Gideon's brownstone, Juniper was carefully folding the final draft of the letter they'd written together. Gideon had fallen asleep on the couch beside her. Breathing, slow but labored, he hadn't let go of her hand. The fire crackled. The letter was stamped, addressed, ready, but she had no idea if it would ever be read. She walked to the front door quietly, not wanting to wake him, and placed the envelope outside for morning pickup. But when she opened the door, someone was already standing there, red coat, violin case, and eyes that looked too much like Gideon's to be coincidence. Juniper, the woman asked. Juniper froze. Yes, I'm Isadora. It was like time snapped. Neither of them spoke for a full 10 seconds. Then Juniper stepped aside. He's inside. Isadora hesitated, trembling. I didn't plan this, neither did I, Juniper whispered, but I think he's been waiting for this moment his entire life. They entered together. Gideon stirred, groggy. His eyes opened. He blinked, then sat up slowed, disbelieving. Isadora, she didn't speak, just dropped her violin case and crossed the room. Juniper moved to leave them alone, but Gideon held out his hand not to stop her, but to include her. No, please, stay. Isadora looked at Juniper, at the softness in her eyes, and finally asked, why her? Gideon swallowed. Because she reminded me what love sounds like. When you stop trying to buy it. Isadora turned to Juniper. Thank you. Juniper shook her head. Don't thank me. I just served coffee. He did the rest. No, Isadora said, her voice shaking. You stayed when it would have been easier to walk away. That night, the three of them sat in silence, broken only by the occasional crackle of firewood and the sound of Gideon reading his letter aloud for both the daughter he had and the daughter he'd found. And somewhere in that quiet, something unspoken passed between all three of them. That family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's chosen, sometimes it's forgiven. And sometimes, in the last place you'd ever expect, it's returned to you. Asterisk. The snow fell heavier that morning. It blanketed the city in silence, as if even time had slowed down to listen. Inside the brownstone, Juniper stirred a pot of oatmeal on the stove, humming the same lullaby her mother used to sing when pain had kept her from sleep. The tune had no words, just warmth, and it filled the kitchen like a prayer. Upstairs, Gideon hadn't woken yet. Juniper glanced at the clock. It was nearly 10. He usually called out by now, asking for his ridiculous herbal tea or grumbling about how oatmeal tasted like softened despair. But today nothing. Isadora stood by the window, arms folded tightly across her chest. She hadn't slept much either. She'd moved into the guest room the night she arrived, not out of obligation, out of choice. Last night had changed something, not instantly, not perfectly, but enough to sit beside her father again. Enough to laugh at his terrible memory when he tried to recall how old she was now. Enough to watch him and Juniper finish the letter together, Gideon's hand trembling, Juniper guiding it with hers. And enough to see him not as the tycoon, but as the man who tried too late, but still tried. Should I check on him? Juniper asked gently, setting the pot aside. Isadora shook her head. Let me. The stairs creaked beneath her feet. The door to Gideon's room was slightly open. Soft light filtered through the curtains. He lay in bed, one hand resting on his chest, the letter on the side table. The fireplace flickered low. She stepped closer. Dad, she whispered. No response. She sat beside him slowly, and that's when she knew. His expression wasn't pained. It wasn't afraid. It was peaceful, as if every jagged shard of regret had finally settled. Isadora didn't cry right away. She simply reached for his hand. It was cool, fingers curled slightly. Then Juniper entered, saw Isadora's face, and stopped in the doorway, and all three of them were quiet again, only this time, in reverence. Later, the doctor confirmed what they already knew. Gideon had passed in his sleep, quietly, without suffering, the way he had wanted. After everything had been said, after the letter, after Isadora, the news reached the public within hours. Every channel ran the headline, Gideon Warwick, billionaire CEO, dies peacefully at 60, leaves behind a legacy, 2 daughters. No one could quite understand what that meant, but to those who had been inside the brownstone, it made perfect sense. At the funeral, Juniper stood beside Isadora, not as a guest, not as a hired help, but as family. Executives whispered, reporters watched, but Juniper ignored them all. She wasn't there to impress anyone. She was there to say goodbye to the man who, in his final days, had given her more belief in herself than anyone ever had. And when the will was read, the room gasped, because Gideon had left something else behind, to Isadora, his private collection of rare violins, his favorite reading room in Tuscany, and the full rights to Warwick's philanthropic arm under her leadership, with a condition, no board interference. To Juniper, the Fulton Street bakery deed, and the apartment above it, fully furnished, paid in full. And a letter, written in Gideon's handwriting. Don't be afraid to open the door. They'll come, Juniper. People who are hungry for something real. Let them in. The world needs your kind of warmth. Years passed. Isadora's foundation grew into one of the most influential art scholarships in the country. She traveled, performed, and funded girls' music schools in places where none had ever existed. And on a quiet corner of Fulton Street, the Haven Bakery opened with little fanfare, but the line wrapped around the block. The walls were painted with soft yellow. The smell of cardamom and fresh pastry drifted out every morning. And on one side wall, near a framed letter with fading ink, hung a photograph of 3 people, 1 man, 2 women, none of them looking at the camera, just at each other, as if caught mid-laughter, as if for one brief miraculous moment. Time had given them a second chance.